This is my favorite.
There is a chill in the air, and it is finally October. My favorite month of the year, my birthday month, and the month where all the boils, ghouls, and non-bind scaries come out to play. Now this is a special time of year, and we are more than lucky to have quite a few spooky love songs, because admittedly, love can be a spooky thing. We start October off with what is arguably the song that plays at one's goth baptism, a song so dark and erotic that it could only come from a man that stood 6'8". The 1993 beloved but overlooked by mainstream charts, Typo Negative's Hello to all you spooky, scary skeletons, and welcome back to Heard It in a Love Song, the show where we backstory of our favorite love songs. I cannot fully express to you how excited I am for this week's episode, as we cover the history of a song that I have loved for ages, from a band that I have loved just as long. My favorite thing is to get people into Typo Negative that somehow have never heard of them. So, if you have or haven't heard of them, settle down with a nice cup of warm apple cider, feel the cool breeze sneaking through the window, and let's dig right in. We start our tale on January 4th, 1962, in Red Hook, Brooklyn, about 10 minutes outside of New York City, where we meet up with Annette and Peter Radijic. These two were no stranger to being parents, because at this point they already had 5 daughters: Annette, who went by Nancy, Barbara, Patricia, Pamela, and Kathleen. But on January 4th, 1962, the mold was decidedly broken, as Annette and Peter, planted firmly at the Adelphi Hospital in Brooklyn, welcomed to the world Petrus Radijic, later and better known by his stage name, Peter Steele. Peter was big, even at birth. He later said, "I was born 24 inches long and 10 pounds. My mother said it was like giving birth to a pumpkin." The Radijic home was a devout Catholic one, which will be funny when you find out who Peter would grow up to be. In September 1964, his father moved the family about 20 minutes south to the Midwood section of Brooklyn. Music was ever present in the Radijic household, with the family gathering on Sundays to have a little family jam. Peter would join in on a makeshift kazoo that he had fashioned from a comb with a piece of wax paper folded over it. This love and appreciation of music left a very strong impression on young Peter. As his older sisters were digging into their collections of 45s, it didn't take long for Peter to follow their lead, with his sister Barbara recalling, "I remember coming home from school, and he'd be sitting on the windowsill in this great big picture window with my phonograph." Peter got his baritone voice from his father, who, as a lullaby, would sing a sailor song from the 1890s called "Asleep in the Deep," covered here by thorough Tony the Tiger Ravenscroft.
Many brave hearts are asleep in the deep.
From kindergarten to 8th grade, he attended Our Lady of Refuge, a Catholic school described by his sisters as much less strict than the Catholic school they went to in Red Hook, Barbara noting that Our Lady of Refuge had Sisters of Mercy as teachers. The Josephite nuns we had were much stricter. They would hit you with a ruler. They were allowed to hit you. Peter's teachers did not do that. There was no abuse. And while there may have been no abuse by the school itself, Peter did not look back fondly at the time. And in classic Peter Steele fashion, his words about the situation were as dirty as his mind, telling LouderSound.com, "I was like a big fucking punching bag. When you go to a Catholic school, men and women develop very differently. I was a late bloomer. My dick didn't get very big until I was in 7th grade. My balls didn't pump up until I was 17. It didn't seem fair that the girls had tits and other guys had mustaches in the 5th grade, and I didn't." And while adult Peter was the very definition of bold, young Petey was very much less so. His sister Barbara recalls, "He was an extremely modest child. He would go to the store for my mother, and she wanted, say, 2 pounds of chicken breast, and he was ashamed to say breast to the butcher, so he would call them chicken chests. And while he was shy about things like that, he was certainly not shy when it came to pranking his sisters, telling Louder Sound, "I was the dictionary definition of an evil brother to them. I loved scaring them to fucking death. At the age of 8, I told them all I'd seen on the news that rats loved to nest in high-heeled shoes. I built it up for weeks. Every Sunday we used to have a pot roast with mashed potatoes. I took my mashed potatoes and mixed it with red food dye and inserted some pins. Then I got up at 3 a.m. and left it in their high heels. I even heated them up so it felt like a real animal. The screams of "Peter!" were incredible, but luckily I was good at hiding under beds. It was also around this time that he began collecting records of his own, one of his favorites being Disneyland Records' chilling, thrilling sounds of the haunted house. He underlined his favorites in pen on the back cover: the dogs, a collection of creaks, screams and groans. Living in a household that appreciated music as much as the Radic household did, by the time the 1960s ended, Peter ran the gamut in terms of his preferred music styles. On top of big band swing, show tunes,
Forget your troubles, come on, get happy.
classical, and pop, he added his own discoveries of the heavier rock music emerging at the time: Iron Butterfly,
Don't you know that I'm loving you?
and Cream.
In the sunshine of your love.
Those two joined the Beatles
I need somebody help, not just anybody help.
as the hyperfixation that Peter was suddenly forming with a very particular type of music. His other sisters kept a revolving door of music playing constantly, and with this, Peter absorbed the sounds of the Rolling Stones, the Byrds, and Detroit combo MC5. But it was one band in particular that changed Little Pete's world in a big way. He was nearly 9 years old, and his sister Kathy returned home with a treasure: the second outing of the British grandfathers of heavy metal, Paranoid by Black Sabbath. The spooky atmosphere that Black Sabbath brought forth into the world made a significant impact on Peter, and by 1973, Peter himself became interested in playing guitar. The comb and paper kazoo didn't hold a candle to the heavy crunch of a distorted guitar. Peter took formal guitar lessons for a few years, but found deeper satisfaction by playing by ear and mimicking songs from his favorite records. He had plenty of time to learn to play on his own as well, because while his sisters were involved with extracurricular activities after school, and while he did long to partake in organized school teams as well, he was restricted by metal leg braces. At the age of 2, Peter was diagnosed with pes planus, or flat-footedness, which is a fairly common affliction, with about 30% of the population being afflicted by it, causing symptoms in 1 in 10 of these people. Usually both feet are affected, but it's possible to have a fallen arch on only one foot. However, Peter's case required correction. Pair the leg braces with his short, stout frame, the chunky little Peter Steele was a pumpkin ripe for name-calling. A growth spurt in Peter tossed out the Gene Belcher body for some awkward lankiness. His frame was now an imposing one, finding him almost a full head taller than most of his peers, and boys even older than him. And despite the growth, the insults still came for the gentle Polish giant. The bullying that made an introvert of Peter also pushed him into an intellectual solitude. He went out of his way to learn everything he could, even away from school. While he always loved the outdoors, he stayed inside a lot. He not only listened to music, he studied it. He also enjoyed machines, but was desperate to learn the mechanics behind them. He was fascinated for a while with train sets, which he set up and played with in the family basement. The Beatles, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, King Crimson, The Doors, and Santana were just some of the new gods being spun on his turntable, and the music, paired with the album artwork, was incredibly influential to him. And it was other image-heavy bands such as Kiss and Devo that gave Peter his own ideas about uniformity and identity in the rock context, conjuring up seeds in his mind that would bloom into full-fledged flowers later on in his career. During this period of his life, Peter found refuge by means of a piano-playing best friend, Josh Silver, with Peter recalling, "I was in a band with Josh and a few guys. I was a temporary rhythm guitarist. They were looking for a bass player, and as soon as they found one, they were going to kick me out. So I ran to the store. I was playing left-handed at the time and traded my guitar for a bass. The asshole at the store would not trade me for a left-handed bass because it was more expensive than the right. He said, 'Take the right-handed bass and you'll learn to play it.' I did, but but that's the only thing I do right-handed. Naming Josh and Peter's band proved challenging. Seeming to take on a new name every day, the name that stuck the longest was Aggression, but they also dubbed themselves Hot Ice, and for an even briefer time, Children of the Grave. With Peter on bass and Josh on keyboards, they cycled through singers, guitarists, and drummers with incredible frequency. Peter's conceptual sense of logo art and design can be seen in the t-shirts he created for Hot Ice, and although they were only playing cover material, a visual identity of who he was and who he wanted to be was already forming in his mind. As these things happen, a change would come quickly. Hot Ice melted as rapidly as it formed. However, there were other neighborhood kids besides Josh and Peter playing instruments, kids as serious about music as they were, and pretty soon, a core of 4 members formed in the stars to create the Northern Lights, a band consisting of Peter Steele, Josh Silver, Dennis Rizzo, and John Campos. Northern Lights grew out of the grammar school circuit quickly and were soon playing local high schools. They were the hot teenage band in the Midwood section of Brooklyn. Soon they showcased themselves at block parties, high schools, and even local Mardi Gras celebrations, somehow even getting gigs at local bars and clubs. But Northern Lights was made up of some talented kids with egos that clashed. They all wanted to make it big, sure, but had very different ideas on how to get there. They might have been a happening name in Midwood, but there were nobodies in the nearby Flatbush and Bensonhurst neighborhoods. And it wouldn't be long before Peter's sense of symmetry and uniformity took over entirely. He was starting to aim for something more imposing, something dark, something powerful, something original. And in June 1978, at the age of 16, Peter got his first job working at Crazy Joe's Metalworks on Quinton Road in Midwood. There, he would construct and design iron security gates, doors, staircases, and custom car and motorcycle parts. In the autumn of 1979, during Peter's senior year at Edward R. Murrow High School, Northern Lights transitioned from playing covers to performing original material. But soon, those Northern Lights would be gone, blown out by the dark and post-apocalyptic aesthetic of their new name, Fallout. With a foundation built on the backs of the Beatles, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, King Crimson, and Kiss, and more recent inspirations like Van Halen, Devo, and The Cars, Fallout emerged with a solidified conceptual framework in place. A heavy metal meets new wave hybrid with lyrics focused on various horror, sci-fi, and film noir movies. From late 1979 to the spring of 1981, 5 songs were demoed: Rock Hard, Batteries Not Included, and Paranthrophagia, which evolved into the also recorded Executioner, Under the Wheels, Bleed For Me, and Fallout. Laying down their music physically on tape empowered the band, and even if the material wasn't released to the public, they began making waves with their live shows. Fallout shows were designed to make an unforgettable impact. The volume was crushing, and the men were larger-than-life figures as they played their music. Peter's onstage presence was a huge part of the Fallout appeal. Already standing 6'8" at 18 years of age, Peter's frame was imposing. Soon, Fallout landed a few gigs opening for Twisted Sister, but it was 1981, and Twisted Sister was only popular in the New York/New Jersey region. A couple of the Twisted Sister and Fallout gigs occurred at 2001 Odyssey on 64th Street in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn, a club immortalized in Saturday Night Fever a few years prior. The band decided they needed to make the next step and get a real record out, but much like Meatloaf and Jim Steinman, their efforts in shopping themselves to labels were entirely unsuccessful. So with the band members' knowledge of the grassroots heavy metal movements happening in Britain at the time, which was made up of bands that they knew were releasing their own 7-inches and LPs, they decided to do the same thing. After hiring audio engineer William Whitman, the band entered Sound Mixers in Manhattan to lay down a song about a real, stiff corpse called Rock Hard. And Batteries Not Included.
Sample my machinery!
The necrophilic themes in Rock Hard formed a thematic basis for much of what Peter would obsess on in later works, dying or lamenting the death of a loved one, and the inability to accept it and move on. Pressed in a run of 500 copies in 1981, the single's artwork features a busty girl in a fishnet shirt and a gas mask concealing her face, and it has since become a highly coveted collector's item. At the time, the band had only moderate success selling the single at shows and on consignment shops like Zigzag Records and Bleecker Bob's. With a few copies on eBay and Discogs going for $500+ today, it is wild to me that they ended up giving away many of the copies just because they weren't able to unload them all. The summer of 1981 found Fallout at critical mass. The wildly different crowd sizes they would amass was weighing on them, and that, paired with the fact that there were no records that would give them the time of day, left Fallout to, well, Fallout. Peter took a realistic attitude about his future in rock and roll, and to ensure he had something to fall back on, he kept working at Crazy Joe's. In September 1981, he also enrolled at Kingsborough Community College in Brooklyn, located at Manhattan Beach, east of Coney Island. He spent every single day thinking about music, but he also hit the books hard over the next several years, eventually graduating with an associate's degree in liberal arts, with a concentration in science, math, and music. In 1982, Josh Silver and John Campos formed Original Sin. Original Sin played some gigs, recorded a 7-inch, but they didn't attract any industry interest, and they returned to New York without much to show for themselves. The other phoenix that attempted to rise from the Fallout ashes was a heavier, much harder band. Peter, teaming up with drummer Louis Beto, put together a band they christened Disciple. Soon they folded in Stan Pillis on guitar, who was a freshman at Edward R. Murrow High School when Peter was a senior. With Pillis on guitar, the trio's attempts to morph into a quartet were repeatedly unsuccessful. Even though Pillis and Beto pleaded with Peter to sing, he refused. When all attempts to find a suitable vocalist failed, Peter begrudgingly took the microphone, hoping it would be temporary. And in June of 1982, the trio took a break from rehearsal to brainstorm the image of the band and decide on a new name. They landed upon a final name, sped out by Peter, Carnivore, which he came up with as it fit them perfectly because they all loved Big Macs. The delivery of his lyrics was important to Peter, and so the search for a vocalist continued, but by April 1983, one still had not been found. Finally, after Beto and Pillis' constant encouragement, Peter gave in. I got a call from Peter at 1 o'clock in the morning, recalls Pillis, and he goes, "Stan, I'm gonna do it. I've decided to be the lead singer of this band." With that established, Carnivore prepared for the first live performance. It had been almost 2 years since Peter and Louis played live with Fallout, and despite Peter's fear of performing in public, he was anxious to get out there and reveal his new band. June 6, 1983 marks Carnivore's first live appearance. The show was at Zappa's, which hosted Fallout many times. Despite a late start, well after 1 a.m., Carnivore's live debut was a success. However, it became apparent to Pillis that what Peter had in mind for the band was a much more narrow scope than what he had hoped for, and after the first gig, Pillis quit the band. But Peter forged ahead, determined to make Carnivore stronger and better. Taking an ad out in the Village Voice, Peter cast a wide net to find the perfect missing piece. The piece came in the form of Keith Alexander Bonanno. With a new guitarist fleshing out the sound and image of the band, Carnivore re-established itself as a force to be reckoned with. In February 1984, Peter was promoted to the crew chief at Laminates Unlimited, a job which he had started the previous February, where he worked as a carpenter of kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom furniture. Later that same year, the band employed the services of their first manager, Ken Creedy. Ken Creedy had been booking local talent at La Amour, which was a wildly successful club in Brooklyn. Some notable acts that performed at the venue included Anthrax, Blue Oyster Cult under their original name Soft White Underbelly, Cannibal Corpse, Carnivore, Cheap Trick, Faith No More, Guns N' Roses, Guar, Hatebreed, Jane's Addiction, King Diamond, Kiss, Lacuna Coil, Megadeth, Metallica, Motorhead, Nightwish, Poison, Quiet Riot, The Ramones, Slayer, Soundgarden, Twisted Sister, and, glimpsing into the future here, Typo Negative. Ken Creedy was impressed with Carnivore's live shows, so he approached the band with a contract and a plan. Creedy promised to help promote and raise global awareness for Peter's new band. And with a demo tape in the works, Carnivore would soon have something for him to promote with. In a small studio called Systems 2 on Avenue U in Brooklyn, the band recorded 3 songs: World Wars 3 and 4,
Leading me to the nuclear grave.
Carnivore,
I'm a meat eater. I'd like to meet ya.
and The Subhuman.
Jack Frost, foaming from the mouth, attacking exposed flesh.
The sessions went quickly and were overseen by Systems 2 engineer Mike Marcinio, who would go on to later engineer Typo Negative's albums. Embracing a Mad Max type aesthetic, the members also altered their names. Louis Beto became Louis Beto. Keith Bonanno took his middle name as his last name, becoming Keith Alexander, and Peter Redigic took the moniker Lord Petrus T. Steele, which stuck for a while before he became known simply as Peter Steele. There was no significant reason for taking the last name Steele, other than it being much easier to pronounce than Radigic, and conjuring an image of something hard. Soon, Carnivore's notoriety grew, and their gigs attracted increasingly bigger crowds on their own, often showing up the headliners. Carnivore appeared at other local clubs like Cheers and The Hangout. While Fallout failed to find a proper recording contract in 1981, things had changed for radical underground metal bands in the intervening years, and by 1985, outfits such as Metallica Metallica and Slayer were making enormous strides with their uncompromising mayhem. In early 1985, a Dutch music fan by the name of Cees Wessels was seeking new talent for his small independent record label, Roadrunner. Wessels founded the label in 1980, licensing various recordings by American singer-songwriter Jim Croce,
Operator, well, could you help me place this call?
who had a strong following in the Netherlands, and also licensing punk bands like The Exploited and Dead Kennedys, specifically for Dutch releases. Wessels began taking interest in the vibrant metal scene in the early 80s, and signings like Merciful Fate proved he had an ear for budding talent. Connie Barrett was a part of New York City's metal and hardcore scene in the mid-1980s, booking bands at the famous CBGB Club in Manhattan and providing consultation to Wessels. While Barrett was never an official employee of Roadrunner in the US, she was instrumental in helping him launch the label in North America. At the time, in the US, Roadrunner was known as Road Racer to distinguish it from its European counterpart. Barrett would pass along the Carnivore demos to Wessels, and he liked what he heard, but he wanted to run them by the top seller for Roadrunner Records at the time, King Diamond, who had recently dissolved Merciful Fate in favor of going it solo. Thanks to Barrett, Wessels, and King Diamond, Carnivore has succeeded where Fallout failed and nabbed themselves a record deal. In 1985's sweltering July heat, with most days recorded as reaching 90-plus degrees, Carnivore recorded their first album over a series of night shifts between midnight and 7 o'clock in the morning. The night shift brought a discounted rate, and for a band of 20-somethings on a label that was still on its baby legs, the discounted rate was an attractive one. Carnivore was released in November 1985, boasting a simple, eye-catching cover drawn by Sean Taggart, an artist popular with a number of New York area metal and hardcore bands. He would also go on to be the character designer and illustrator for the Jerky Boys. Carnivore did not tour to support the album, which kept them mostly as a regional sensation. The record was in stores all over North America and Europe, but without touring, it was destined to become a cult favorite at best. This was not for a lack of Roadrunners trying, and Beto and Bonanno were eager to tour, but Peter had no interest. By late 1985, due to a lot of infighting between Keith Bonanno and Peter, Keith decided to leave, and the Carnivore Rhythm section yet again was in search of a worthy guitarist. Around the same time, Peter left Laminates Unlimited, citing that the job offered no advancement possibilities. He jumped to McDonald Metal and Roofing Supply, where he was in charge of shipping, receiving, and delivery of roofing and home supplies. After some time doing some work for the new hardcore band Agnostic Front, the duo placed ads in various local music papers, including the Village Voice. And through the Voice ad, they acquired guitarist Mark Piovanetti. Some of Mark's influences matched Peter and Louis. He had grown up on the Beatles and considered Black Sabbath and Judas Priest as major inspirations. But Mark's other music interest went in a variety of directions. Bands like Rush,
A Monday warrior, mean stride. Today's Tom Sawyer, mean pride.
Triumph, Van Halen, and artists like Ted Nugent,
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
and Billy Joel. Mark's first ever show with Carnivore, playing at CBGB, was his first show with any band. But there was an elephant in the room that the band didn't want to confront. The first Carnivore album may have built a cult following for the band, but the record's company failed to secure a tour, and Peter's dislike of traveling far from home forced a reality onto the band. They would have to get real jobs in case Carnivore didn't pan out for the long haul. Taking a job briefly with the UPS, while still working for the roofing supply company, Peter eventually realized that a position in civil service would give him a secure future. The new job, mixed with the uncertainty of the future, prompted Peter to shave his long black mane into a buzz cut. Springtime of 1987 found Carnivore embarking on Retaliation, their follow-up to the self-titled album. Time was split between the familiar surroundings of Systems 2 and producer Alex Perelia's upstate studio, Pyramid Sound, in Ithaca. He was one of the hottest thrash metal producers at the time, lending his expertise to albums by Anthrax, Overkill, Testament, and Nuclear Assault. Louis had found employment as a city bus driver, and being a new employee, days off were scarce, so the drummer recorded his parts, as Peter did his, at Systems 2. Retaliation was built on 10 original tracks, as well as a cover of Manic Depression by Jimi Hendrix,
Depression is touching my soul!
and an intro skit titled Jack Daniels and Pizza, which was a depiction of too much whiskey and pizza coming out the way it came in. Peter created this piece by shoving 2 fingers down his throat to produce a retching sound and tossing canned tomatoes in a sink full of water. By July 1987, Peter took a job with the New York City Parks and Recreation Department, assigned as a city park worker in Brooklyn's District 2. Peter drove a dump truck and was in charge of a mobile crew that worked at various public swimming pools and parks in the district. Over time, he completed forestry and tree pruning training, achieved various promotions, and learned how to operate a variety of machinery and tools, including tractor trailers, wood chippers, and jackhammers. Peter eventually gained the nickname the Green Man because of the uniform that the job required him to wear. Peter genuinely loved the parks. He cared for them and the forest of upstate New York, and he would later say, "I was the Green Man, the guy who maintained nature. If someone littered or abused the property that I maintained, I would confront these people. I became very vigilant about it, and it never happened again." By 1988, Peter's labor of love, Carnivore, was slowly going nowhere. Carnivore was grounded, as the travel restrictions of their day jobs made it so that Peter and Louis couldn't travel much. Not that Peter wanted to. And they could only play La Amour and CBGB so much before thinning out their local appeal. After they stopped playing shows, however, Retaliation started to take on a life of its own without any promotion from the record company. Just by word of mouth and being played on college radio. It became this legendary underground record that reached more people than the band realized behind the scenes and across the world. But it was too late for the band to capitalize on its newfound popularity, and by the spring of 1989, Carnivore was officially done with. For 6 months in 1989, Peter had no band. He had written new music, but Carnivore had fizzled out, so the ideas that were brewing needed an identity. Soon, Peter started jamming with a musician that had been in the same spaces as Carnivore, former drummer of Toxemia, Sal Abrascato, and despite finding a new jamming partner, depression had a full stranglehold on Peter, and on October 15th, 1989, Peter decided suicide was the only way out, with him later being quoted as saying, "I don't think people who commit suicide are cowards. I think they are heroes, because they are taking a journey that nobody has ever come back from, and nobody knows what's there." When asked if he considers suicide a solution, he answered by saying, "Definitely. I don't think that life is sacred. I think that life is pretty much a waste of time, and part of being successful at anything is knowing when to bow out. I'll never die of colon cancer or heart disease or of a brain tumor. When I become useless by my own standards, when I cannot function as a man, I'm going to do a swan dive off the World Trade Center, hopefully onto someone I hate." When asked what kept him from being successful in his suicide attempt, he simply said, "Didn't cut deep enough." With a large pile of lyrics, largely inspired by the events brewing in Peter's life and inside his ever-active mind, he kept hammering out ideas with Sal. Sal eventually introduced a guitarist to Peter, a fellow Brooklynite named Kenny Hickey, who was looking for someone that was more serious about music than the handful of cover bands he had been in and left. The trio of Peter, Sal, and Kenny worked up songs that finally had names, unsuccessfully coping with the natural beauty of infidelity, Zero Tolerance, Prelude to Agony, and Der Untermensch. Having songs was one thing, but Peter knew something was missing. A performance he attended at the Ritz clued him into exactly what it was that he was missing. The band performing was Devo, and Peter knew that he had to get in contact with a ghost of his past, Fallout bandmate Josh Silver. The two knew that the chemistry and camaraderie they once shared could be just the thing that was finally needed to succeed in the music space that was much different than it was during the Fallout days. Half a year after Carnivore's burnout, Peter now had a real band taking shape. August 28, 1989 is the date Peter has identified as the origin of his new band. The band's name was something of an ever-changing uncertainty for almost a year, as they went through the following names: New Minority, Raw Sludge, Utility, and Repulsion. For a while, the Repulsion name stuck. The music that came out of the System's 2 sessions emerged as a cassette bearing the title None More Negative, with 3 songs on each side, Side Blood and Side Fire. The last track on Side Blood was the first of several recorded practical jokes that the band would play. For example, the misinterpretation of silence and its disastrous consequences was a song of almost nothing. 1 minute of quiet tape hiss. Repulsion's None More Negative cassettes were released throughout all the usual channels, sold in consignment shops and local record shops like Zigzag, and the band's early shows. It was also traded through the underground tape trading network. Peter continued to work for the Parks and Recreation Department, accruing vacation days by working as many paid city holidays as possible, with each of those awarding him time and a half and another day off with pay. This allowed him to balance his band and his job, both of which he loved dearly. In late 1990, Peter approached one-time Carnivore manager Ken Creedy, asking him if he might be able to pull some strings to get a record label interested in the None More Negative tape. Ken had already become interested in Peter's new project back when they were going by New Minority, so he accepted the challenge. Once word got around to Roadrunner Records that Peter's new project was up for grabs, the label intervened. Technically, Peter had not fulfilled his obligation to his original contract with Roadrunner, which meant that they had the first right of refusal on any of his future work, but as fate would have it, they were interested, particularly a young Roadrunner employee named Monty Connor. Connor, who began working for Roadrunner in 1987, was instrumental in signing the later platinum band Slipknot. It was decided that the None More Negative recording was good enough to pass as an album, so Roadrunner set the wheels in motion to resume Peter's contract with his new band, but they wouldn't be able to keep the name Repulsion, as in 1989, Michigan death metal band Repulsion released their debut album, Horrified, through a UK-based record label, and the album had gained notoriety, establishing them as the band Repulsion. So Peter was on the hunt for yet another name. He settled on Sub-Zero, which worked well in its meaning with the already conceived symbol of a minus sign with a circle, or zero. A hardcore band in Queens had already claimed the name, so it was back to the drawing board, with Peter recalling, "It was up to me to think of a name to go with the logo. I don't normally listen to the radio, but there was a request for Typo Negative Blood by the Red Cross, and I was like, well, that's it. Typo Negative." In what would be the first of many attention-grabbing stunts Roadrunner would employ in cooperation with the band, they made a minor media spectacle of the contract signing, with rumors swirling that Peter signed his contract with a mixture of blood and semen. They retooled the None More Negative demo and added on to it, and in June of 1991, the renamed and reworked album was released into the world, now known as Slow, Deep, and Hard. Sales of Slow, Deep, and Hard were initially not very impressive, but promising enough that the label considered putting the band on the road to generate further interest. Touring was not something Peter was eager to do, but he realized it was a necessity, and he had accrued enough vacation time to do so. For their first US tour, the band was booked to open for punk legends The Exploited, with fellow Brooklyn friends Biohazard as part of the package. Biohazard's presence helped Peter cope with the string of 30 dates that were scheduled throughout the US in November of 1991. Having friends along also helped dull the strains and stresses of road life. But the tour was a nightmare for Peter and the boys in Typo Negative. Tancredi recalls, "Waddy from The Exploited was a maniac and kept canceling shows. We did about 2.5 weeks and then said enough. Typo Negative bailed somewhere in Kansas and made a beeline back to Brooklyn. Waddy's bouts of sickness arose from various moments of temporary insanity, like when he started breaking light bulbs in his hand, causing a serious case of blood poisoning. Peter realized it was the wrong tour for all kinds of reasons, musical, personal, even ideological. The European leg of the tour was decidedly worse, with most countries they were set to tour in either canceling the shows or showering the boys with death threats, as they deemed their music too hateful, vile, or not in line with their own beliefs. After returning home to Brooklyn, Peter and Typo Negative headed into a year that treated them much better than the previous one had. In 1992, the record sales picked up in a big way thanks to the controversy in Europe. Slow, Deep, and Hard was selling well enough that Roadrunner Records demanded some kind of new release to capitalize on the fortune that spawned from their misfortune in Europe. The follow-up, born out of the fact that they didn't really have much time to create new material, was a quote-unquote live album entitled The Origin of Feces, released in May of 1992. The band's sick humor and the practical joke concept of The Origin of Feces was reflected in the artwork too, with the artwork literally showing Peter's ass cheeks spread wide for a photographer who remains anonymous. It shows very clearly the origin of feces. The next Typo Negative studio album would be a mystery to everyone but Peter in its early stages. Not even his band members were sure what direction his writing was taking. The album Bloody Kisses was recorded through February and March of 1993 at Systems 2 Studio in Brooklyn and released on August 17, 1993. To anyone familiar with the first two Typo Negative albums, it seemed a radical departure. Even the artwork signaled a shift in perspective. And then when the band began feeding various tracks to eager ears at Roadrunner, people there immediately felt the material was special. Monty Connor would say, "Myself and the bosses at the label were immediately blown away."
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet.
This was a whole new, lush, layered epic goth metal beast. We zeroed in on Christian Woman and Black Number 1 immediately as the two key tracks. And it wasn't rocket science because the demos of these songs had all the same magic you hear on the final album versions. Those songs came to us fully formed, and that shows just how strong the band's vision was right from the start. Bloody Kisses opens with Machine Screw, machine noises laid over the sound of a woman moaning with pleasure. Peter's voice then introduces Christian Woman, paraphrasing Luke 23:34.
Forgive her, for she knows not what she does.
Over 9 enthralling minutes, Christian Woman sums up exactly what Type O Negative's new image was. The song tells the tale of a woman so infatuated with her Christ-like lover, she eroticizes Jesus on the cross. Probably one of the best cover songs of all time lives on Bloody Kisses, a cover of Seals and Crofts' Summer Breeze. Peter, when asked why they covered it, said that it was only 4 chords, and that was all that they knew, so it was an obvious choice. But let's let the black cat out of the bag and talk about what we are all here for, the goth girl anthem, Black Number 1, parentheses, Little Miss Scarrow.
Oh, baby, really monster, ain't got nothing on you.
The song takes place on Halloween, which is the perfect time for a spooky love song, and the narrator tells the tale of how he went looking for trouble and he found it, in the form of a pale woman who wore wolfskin boots, smoked clove cigarettes, and smelled like burning leaves. Now, the fact that Peter Steele was employed by the New York City Parks and Recreation Department before making it big was not really a secret. Many know why he was dubbed the Green Man. However, the fact that is not as common knowledge is the fact that he wrote Black Number 1 while in a garbage truck. I was waiting in line for 3 hours to dump 40 cubic yards of human waste at the Hamilton Avenue Marine Transfer Station, and I wrote the song on my head. I'm not kidding you. And it's about the girl I fucking slashed my wrist over. She was the ultimate goth girl, and I was poking fun at her because she was so in love with herself. I actually lost the original lyrics to that song, so I had to rewrite them. It is arguably their best known song, although it never cracked the Billboard Hot 100. It was their best selling single, and the video was a mainstay on MTV's Headbangers Ball. The video was recorded in black and white, with the exception during the breakdown where Peter Steele's eyes appear olive green in a close-up. My favorite part is that Peter Steele is playing an upright bass as if it were a bass guitar, which is something that only somebody 6'8" could do. Black Number 1 comes in at 95 beats per minute. As I am writing this episode, I am sitting in a dark room, listening to Type O Negative, as the breeze of a 64-degree fall night comes seeping in through my 3rd floor apartment windows. Wafting in on the breeze is the smell of burning leaves, and I cannot believe that I get to talk about this band and this song for so long. I've always had a great love and appreciation for Type O Negative. They just conjure up a world that I never want to leave. And Black Number 1 is a world in and of itself. And I think that we have all been with someone that was way too obsessed with themselves, and yet we were still drawn to them, even if loving them was like loving the dead. Obviously, this is not the end of Type O Negative's story, and if you know the end, I'm sure you're very aware of that. So we will come back to Type O Negative in the future. This week's Love Homework is a song by a band you may not expect to have a spooky love song, Ludo, with a song that expresses what it feels like to be so in love with someone you would kill for them. You would do anything to press your bodies closer together than is physically possible. The horror of our love.
But I'll grind against your bones until our marrows mix. I will eat you slowly.
And since it's the season I love most, I'm also going to give you horror homework. This week, I am recommending my favorite recent horror movie, and that is James Wan's latest, Malignant. Go in blind and be prepared for some of the wildest shit you have ever seen. It is currently streaming on HBO Max, and it is also in theaters for those that are so inclined. It's October! We have 4 more spooky episodes to enjoy this month, so please subscribe if that really lights your jack-o'-lantern and tricks your treats. Subscribe, leave a like, and hit that bell. I release a new episode every Friday. Until next time, remember to check under your bed and in your closets. And remember, you heard it in a love song.